Hello everybody, I'm Miss Jessica from EVPL McCullough, and we're continuing our Chapter Book Storytime Variety Pack, where we are previewing a little bit of a story so that you can get an idea if you would like to continue it, because there are so many books out there and it's really hard to decide what to read next. I'm hopefully introducing you to some really good titles that sound interesting and exciting to read. So the last time we were together, I may have cheated just a little bit when we were spinning our wheel to see what we were going to read next, but we have not landed on this genre for a while, and I have a book that has been sitting there for a while looking at me saying, please read me, because it looks really, really interesting. So I might have cheated, and we are going to be reading a book from the genre adventure. So we are going to be reading The Elephant Thief by Jane Kerr. And this one, just the title and the picture on the front of it alone got my attention. And then when I started reading about this book, I was like, yep, sorry, this has to be read. It sounds amazing and exciting and like an extremely good adventure. So I'm sorry, I had to do it. I had to do it because, I mean, it looks like an excellent book. All right, so let's see what this book is about. But before I do that, this is available as a print book. It is also available as an e-audiobook. So if you would like to continue listening to the story, you can. All right, so The Elephant Thief, a race against time. When young pickpocket Danny accidentally buys an elephant at an auction, he finds himself swept up on an unforgettable adventure. Offered a job by a zookeeper, all he has to do is ride Majaraja from Edinburgh to Manchester in 1 week. Everyone in the country is watching, even the Queen, but the journey soon proves to be filled with drama and danger. A rival zookeeper will stop at nothing to make sure they fail, and soon Danny's shady connections from his past threaten to overturn the mission. Can Danny win the trust and friendship of the elephant and guide him home? Can the two of them stick together through the odds and win the day? So that's an interesting adventure to have to get a elephant across a country. So I don't know about you guys, but I'm excited. All right, so The Elephant Thief. Okay, Chapter 1, somewhere in Edinburgh, April 8th, 1872. He couldn't breathe. His lungs were pumping, his lips were open, but there still wasn't enough air. The sack covering his head blocked out everything. His nose, his eyes, his mouth. Fear burnt in his stomach, sharp and acidic. He wondered where he was being taken and why. But most of all, he wondered if he was going to survive the night. Outside, the horses slowed and the carriage jerked to a stop. Move! Boy felt a rough shove in the center of his back, and he toppled gracelessly from the carriage. The ground hurt, and he cursed every decision he'd made that night. If he'd been more careful, less cocky, he would have seen the two men waiting outside the abandoned boarding house where he'd been living for the last 3 months. But by the time he had, it had been too late. The hood had already covered his face and his arms had been twisted behind his back. Get up, you little runt! Heavy hands lifted him to his feet. The night breeze chilled his skin. Somewhere nearby, a door was wrenched open, and instinctively he turned towards it. Then he was pushed, almost stumbling across the threshold. Where was he? What did they want with him? Fear pulsed frantically at his chest. Abruptly, the sack was torn from his head, and he gulped in air. Every mouthful tasted of damp and decay and the sea. He pivoted slowly on his heels and tried to focus. He was in an old warehouse. Judging by the sounds and smells, it must be close to the docks. At the far end of the room, a man stood by the only window. A shaft of moonlight turned him into a dark silhouette. Boy, so glad you could come. The voice was instantly recognizable, and Boy's breath stuttered. Frank Scatcherd, leader of the Leith Brotherhood, a collection of Edinburgh's worst criminals and thugs, and the man who called himself the King. I expect you want to know why you're here. Casually, Scatcherd pushed away from the window. As he walked, his steel-capped boots tapped on the bare floorboards. Boy waited, but the king was in no hurry. It was as though he knew that every second hiked the fear a little higher. Well, nothing to say? Now Scatcherd was so close that Boy could see the pattern of the silk scarf tied around his neck. The king liked to look good. His hair was slick with barber's oil and a cap tilted jauntily over one ear. It was rumored that a razor had been sewn into the peak so he could blind a man with a single head jab. But no one knew for certain if that was true. Boy swallowed, throat as dry as dust, but he said nothing. The silence stretched for several heartbeats. Then Scatcherd slid a knife from his jacket sleeve. So, you're still not talking. Deliberately, he rolled the blade in his palm, forwards and backwards, forwards and back. What a pity. Boy lifted his chin and stared at the moving knife, the jagged tip rusty with old blood, and he knew it wasn't bravery that kept him silent. Right at this moment, he wished he could make any sound at all, but he couldn't. Well, lucky for you, I don't need your voice. The knife stopped moving. I assumed you've heard of Wormwell auction? Cautiously, Boy nodded. Everyone in Edinburgh knew about the auction. Walter Wormwell owned the Royal No. 1 Menagerie, the most famous traveling show in the country. But 2 weeks ago, he had been found lying in his study as dead and cold as untouched chicken supper. According to gossip, he left behind a large collection of zoological animals and an even larger collection of debt. Tomorrow, the entire menagerie was being sold to settle those bills. What Boy didn't understand was Scatcherd's interest. Why would the king bother with a penniless bankrupt like Wormwell, or an auction of zoo animals? It made no sense. 2 days before he died, Wormwell stole money from me, a great deal of money. Naturally, I want it back, and you are going to get it for me. Boy swallowed, trying to sort through the significance. A part of him was relieved. He was going to be allowed to walk out of here alive. This time there would be no punishment, no pain. I've already had his house searched. Nothing, not even a penny under the floorboards. The menagerie is the only place left. Of course, I'd prefer to go to the auction myself, but the police are sniffing around, so I've decided to send you. Scatcherd's lips twisted into a smile. My pet thief. Boy flinched. How could he find a missing fortune when the Brotherhood had failed? And what would he be looking for? Coins, bank papers, gold? It had every sign of being a fool's errand. My men will get you inside the pavilion. Scatcherd jerked his head at the 2 thugs standing on either side of the doorway. From there, you're on your own. Keep your eyes and ears open. Wormwell had the money and there has to be a trace somewhere. And remember. Boy waited, heart tripping. Scatcherd raised the knife and gently trailed it along Boy's arm. It stopped at his wrist just above the ugly tangle of scars. The last time I asked you for a favor, you let me down. This is your chance to make it up to me. Abruptly, Scatcherd's fist twisted and the blade sliced through skin. Boy clenched his teeth against the pain. And if you fail, just imagine what I will do to you. Boy hung by his fingertips from the top of the high stone wall, feeling the strain through every muscle. He closed his eyes and let go. His landing was clumsy, but silent. Finally, he was inside the auction ground. On the other side of the wall, he heard Scatcherd's thugs muttering to themselves, then their heavy footsteps as they walked away. They'd done their job, now it was up to him. And if you fail, just imagine what I will do to you. Scatcherd's words chased through his head like night shadows. He rubbed his wrist and felt the old scars beneath his fingers. He didn't need to imagine what would happen if he failed. He already knew. But there was no need to panic. He was good at this, faster, smarter, better than anyone else. And the truth was that in this crush, no one would even notice a pickpocket. They were too busy staring at one of the strangest sights Edinburgh had ever seen. 2 leopards, some tigers, 1 battered baboon, and a handful of camels trudged around Waverley Pavilion. Then came a line of antelope, 2 hyenas, 1 spotted, 1 striped, and a golden lioness whose tail swished as she walked. Boy had never seen anything like them before. Animals that weren't cats or dogs or rats. The only reason he knew their names was because of the auctioneer. Bartholomew Trot liked the sound of his own voice. And finally, one Siberian brown bear sold to the London Zoological Gardens for 40 guineas. Mr. Trot brought his hammer down and smiled, the smile of a man making money. London's got a bargain here. He's young, healthy, and lively as a trout. But the bear was already causing trouble. Jaws wide, he reared up on hind legs and fanned out his claws. Boy knew it wouldn't do any good. Escape was impossible. 2 zookeepers were already pulling on his chains, and defeated, the animal fell sprawling to the ground. Boy turned away, trying to ignore the tug of sympathy. Instead, he examined the pavilion field. Most spectators stood near the curtained stage where the animals were being brought up for auction. A little farther back, there were rows of cages and wagons that housed the rest of Wormwell Menagerie. They were probably the best place to start. He reached into his bucket and checked for the small blade he carried to slash open pocket linings and to cut purse strings. It was still there. He was ready. An hour later, Boy had found nothing. He'd pried open crates, crawled under wagons, and plunged his head inside several straw-stuffed cages. But just as he'd expected, it was useless. There was no gold, no jewels, no banknotes. His only real success was hidden in the lining of his jacket. A hoard of stolen pennies, silk handkerchiefs, and a lady's scarf pin. He'd even managed to sneak a tin whistle from the pocket of one of Mr. Trot's clerks. Boy reached it to the last of the cages and sidled along a corner. The path was blocked by a group of animal keepers talking to a man in a crumpled suit. Instinct made him pull back. He was a fraction too late. Oi! What do you think you're doing, lad? Come here, I want a word. Spinning on his heels, Boy ran, weaving through the wagons before blending into the crowd again. Only then did he risk looking over his shoulder. The man with the crumpled suit was craning across the heads of the spectators. Boy hunched his shoulders and kept low. His heart thudded. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Trot bellowed. Couldn't have been better timed. Everyone's heads turned toward the stage. 4 men were lowering a cage onto a raised plinth. Behind the metal bars, a lion glowered sulkily. May I present Hannibal, the handsomest beast in the jungle. On cue, the lion rose up onto his feet, opened his jaws, and roared. The crate lurched sideways. Boy winced at the screams. No need to be alarmed, ladies. He's as tame as a spring lamb and as gentle as a kitten. I'd climb in there myself if I wasn't wearing my second best coat. Now, who'll start the bidding? 200! Shouted one large gentleman in the front row. He must be one of the guests who owned a zoological house or traveling menagerie. Boy had even heard a rumor that an American showman called Barnum had sent a buyer from across the ocean. 210! 220! 230! Very well, 300. It was the large man again, his face half hidden by a gray plume of sideburns. A line of gold buttons curved across his jacket. And I hope he can play piano for that. The crowd laughed as the hammer came down. Sold to Mr. Arthur Arbright of the Yorkshire Zoological Gardens for 300 guineas. Mr. Trot nodded to the winning bidder, who smiled through his whiskers as if he had captured the lion himself. Congratulations, Mr. Albright. He's a beautiful animal. Mr. Trot shuffled his papers and Boy pushed a little closer, a flush of nerves prickling his skin. The final lot had been reached. His time was running out. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I have for you the largest and cleverest elephant ever exhibited in our great country, Maharaj the Magnificent. From the side of the stage, a curtain twitched and fell. Standing in the waves of purple cloth was the biggest star of Royal No. 1 Menagerie, and Boy forgot every reason he was there. With tusks as long as a man's leg, the elephant towered above the crowd. His rippled gray skin stretched over a wide back before falling into deep folds where his legs met body. Each ear, as large as a tablecloth, had faded at its edges as though scrubbed by an overly enthusiastic washerwoman. If the queen herself had emerged, she couldn't have caused more of a stir. Not only had Boy never seen anything like this creature, he'd never imagined one existed. The elephant must be the strongest, most powerful animal to walk the earth. But it was Maharaja's trunk that hooked his curiosity. as bizarre as a man with a third arm. It was coiled around a wooden stick that the elephant brandished like a street magician would weave a wand. Boy couldn't take his eyes away. Then, without warning, Maharaj swung the club at Mr. Trot. The crowd gasped. Boy tensed, waiting for the blow to land. This was going to be painful. But a bare inch from trouble, the elephant slowed and gently tipped the auctioneer's hat from his head. As you can see, ladies and gentlemen, he loves a bit of tomfoolery. Mr. Trot didn't look amused. He scooped up the hat and pushed it back on. Come on, 𝐶𝐸𝐸, walk the beast about. We've not got all day. From the side of the stage, a slim, wiry man emerged. To Boy's eyes, he looked almost as remarkable as the elephant. His red trousers were baggy at the knee and gathered at the ankle. Embroidered straps held a long silver-headed cane to his chest, and a circle of white cloth covered his head, creating a peculiar type of hat. But most fascinating of all was the color of his skin, because this man was the first person Boy had ever seen with skin just as brown as his own. Well, get on with it. Time's money. Mr. Trot tapped his hammer impatiently. 𝐶𝐸𝐸's solemn face didn't even flicker. Instead, he held his palms together as though in prayer and bowed slowly. The entire field hushed. Impressed, Boy lifted up onto his toes. He didn't want to miss a moment. 𝐶𝐸𝐸 whistled into one of Maharaja's huge ears. The elephant stomped forwards, and Boy felt the earth shake beneath his feet. The tremor seemed to reach up and wrap around his bones. See his noble brow. Observe this proud creature. This magnificent beast was once the personal pet of an Indian prince before he was given to the Russian Tsar. I'm told he only agreed to part with the animal in exchange for 6 bags of gold. Boy could hear rumbling around the menagerists. I'll start the bidding at 500. Mr. Trot peered at those on the front row. Gentlemen, may I remind you of the strength of this great creature? He's been known to pull the weight of 20 grown men in a wagon for several miles going uphill. Reluctantly, Boy dropped back onto his heels. He didn't have time for daydreaming. He needed to hide until the pavilion cleared and then start the search again. Twisting, he slid back through the crush. A sudden surge knocked him off balance, and his jacket swung open. A silver whistle tipped out. A few pennies followed, then a hat pin, then his pickpocketing blade, and 1 leather glove. You thieving little beggar! A hand clamped around his neck, and for a moment Boy was frozen. Then he fought. He kicked and punched and scratched, but nothing worked. The fist refused to loosen. Wriggling, he tried to see who held him. It was a man, solid and squat, and wearing what surely was the brightest red waistcoat in the whole of Edinburgh. Oi, cripple, sling this runt up here, will ya? He won't be able to go nowhere. Another hand grabbed his collar. He winced into the air and was brought face to face with a giant, one of the keepers who had tackled the Siberian bear. Hope bled away. Over here, Gov! The keeper reached a tall column beside the pavilion gate. Once a marble statue would have stood there, but now it was empty. Boyne was thrown up roughly. The bricks scraped his shins. That's the place. He won't be shifting in a hurry. Red waistcoat was already scurrying back towards the auction stage. You keep an eye out. I'll deal with him later. Boy glanced down, and his stomach lurched. The ground looked really far away. For one moment, he considered jumping, but the cold spring had hardened the earth to rock. A fall was certain to break a bone, most likely one in his neck. Desperately, he searched for another escape. The stage was only a stone's throw away, but everyone's attention was on the sale, and even if he saw him, it was unlikely anyone would help. He was trapped, his throat so clogged with fear he needed to breathe faster to get enough air. I must tell you that Mr. Angus McKeith, a leading butcher in this fair city, is keen to introduce elephant steaks to Scotland. I hope this will influence your bids, gentlemen. I'm certain none of us would want to see such a fine beast on our dinner plates. A hand snapped up. Yes, 550 now with Mr. Albright. Will anyone give me 560? From his perch, Boy spotted Red Waistcoat waving furiously at the back of the bidders. A rush of anger mixed with his fear. This man was to blame. It was his fault that he was caught as firmly as a fish on a hook. Then Boy realized something which brought a small spark of satisfaction. Red Waistcoat was in a trouble of his own. People had pushed forward for the final sale, blocking the auctioneer's view. What Boy could see, Mr. Trot could not. Red Waistcoat and his attempts to bid for the elephant might as well be invisible. 560 from Monsieur Clementard of the Ménagerie du Jardin in Paris. Am I offered more? Frantically, Red Waistcoat waved again, but the auctioneer's gaze was fixed on the front row. Mr. Albright? A nod. That's 570 from you, Mr. Albright. The words seemed to jolt Red Waistcoat. Boy saw him whirl away from the stage like a scarlet spinning top. Puffing and panting, he broke into a waddling run, darting between the spectators. On another day, Boy would have laughed. Today, he couldn't even smile. Red Waistcoat was heading back towards the column. But why? Raise your arm, lad, raise your arm. He was getting nearer. Do it now! Now! I'll not be outgunned by that Yorkshire cheat. Boy hesitated. It made no sense at all, but every instinct screamed that this was a golden opportunity. So, how could he twist it to his advantage? Just put your arm up in the air and wave! He'll see you up there! Red Waistcoat's voice was growing more desperate as he got closer. Crowds still blocked his path. Come on, come on! But Boy didn't wave. He did something much better. Bringing his fingers to his lips, he whistled, loud and clear and shrill. The notes soared over the heads of the spectators. They turned in one movement as though pulled by a single string. Boy made sure everyone was looking, and then he lifted his arm. Well, it seems we've got a late bidder. Peering across, Mr. Trot pointed with his hammer. 580 there on the column. But he can't. He's just a child. The shouts from the front row were loud enough for Boy to hear. He dropped his arm quickly. What had he done? After a lifetime of trying to stay out of sight, he was caught center stage, and there was no one to blame but himself. Of course he can. Red Waistcoat had reached the column. He leaned against the stone base, breathless but triumphant. The lad's with me, with me. But Boy knew it was never going to be that easy. Nothing ever was. Sure enough, Mr. Albright was already pushing through the crowd, his gray whiskers quivering. This is outrageous, Mr. Trot. You can't go along with it. I was invited on the understanding that this would be a fair sale among gentlemen, not children. It's certainly not grubby street urchins. I'm sorry, Mr. Albright, but as long as there's money to back up the bid, I have to accept it. The auctioneer lifted his voice. Mr. Jameson, if the boy's with you, can I be assured you have the funds? I'm good for 580 and more besides that. Then let's finish this now. Mr. Albright's gold buttons rose on his chest. I'll give you 620, but that's my final offer. You won't be getting a better one. Faces turned expectantly. The sideshow wasn't over yet. Boy looked down at Red Waistcoat. Even at the distance, he could see a gleam in the man's eye. What say we go higher, lad? About 700 do it? Never in his whole life had Boy imagined being in the reach of so much money. It was just possible that 700 guinea would help buy all the food in the city. He put his fingers to his lips and whistled. 700! Red Waistcoat shouted. 700! Boy waved again, and the crowd roared. For several moments, nothing else could be heard, not even Mr. Albright's protests. It looks as though the boy has bought himself an elephant. Mr. Trot brought his hammer crashing down. Sold for 700 guinea to the Bellevue Zoological Gardens in Manchester, owned by Mr. James Jameson. For one glorious moment, Boy actually believed Maharaj was his. It was as good as dipping for a sixpence and finding a sovereign instead. Maybe it was even better than that. And then he remembered. This wasn't his victory. It wasn't even his fight, and it certainly wasn't his money. On the ground below, Mr. Jameson was bouncing up and down on short legs like an excited toad. His red waistcoat bloated with pride. I beat that snobby, stuck-up buffoon. I beat him fair and square. The crowd cheered again so loudly that at first only Boy noticed Maharaj lumbering towards them. Then people were forced to shuffle aside. Boy envied them. If he had been on solid ground, he would have run until his legs gave out. But he could only watch as Maharaj stopped in front of him. Gold eyes, bright as candle flames, stared back, then blinked. Suddenly, the elephant swung his trunk. Boy jerked away, then cursed at his own stupidity. There was nothing behind him but air. He was going to fall straight onto the cold, hard earth. In that terrifying half-second, Boy wondered if it would just have been easier to just let it happen. He never found out. A tight grip stopped his dive backwards. Maharaj's trunk curled around his wrist, warm and rough. Boy's heartbeat slowed. The clever gold eyes blinked again, and when they opened, he saw himself reflected back. a scrawny boy in stolen clothes. For a moment, it was just the two of them. My good Lord, will you look at that? The lad and the elephant, they're shaking hands. And later, Boy realized that was how it all began. All right, we're going to stop there. So this is picking up with chapter 2, and such an interesting story that back when this is set in the 1800s, so 1872, you have to think they really didn't have television like we have now. They didn't have movies. And somebody in this boy's situation definitely has never visited a zoo. So he's never seen these animals before or been up close to them. So imagine seeing an elephant for the first time and what that must be like. That must be absolutely shocking. It must be exciting, because if you've never seen an elephant before, or actually any of these animals, an elephant must look very, very odd, especially with its long trunk. So this is kind of an interesting start to a story, that he's going to have to get this elephant across a country somehow, and obviously these zookeepers are definitely fighting over who should get to own it. So what an interesting concept for an adventure. So if you would like to keep reading this story, you can go to our website, evpl.org, and place a hold on a physical copy, or check out the e-audiobook. You can also give us a call. You can visit us, and we would be happy to help you get a copy of this book. All right, so let's find out what we're reading next time. All right, so we're going to spin our wheel and see what we're going to be reading next time. So we just did adventure. So our choices are science fiction, historical fiction, humor, fantasy, spooky, mystery, realistic fiction, and then back to adventure. And again, if we land on something that we have had recently, I will spin it again just so that we get some variety. That's the whole point of this. All right, so here we go. Ooh, big spin. And let's see, science fiction. We haven't had that one in a while. All right, so next time we're together again, we will be reading a science fiction story. So thank you very much for joining me today. I hope you had some fun listening to our story. If you go to evpl.org, our website, you can see all of our amazing resources that we have there. You can see what programs we have coming up, whether they're virtual or in person. Don't forget, you can always stop by and visit us and see what's going on. Follow us on all the socials and like and subscribe and all the things. And then you can be notified when we're going to be doing something new again soon. And I hope to see you again next Friday for our next chapter book story time. So see you then. Bye.